Hello everyone, and welcome to our next episode of the Ups and Downs, the retro Ups and Downs, if you will. Although, for the first time in a while, we're moving into the 21st century. Yes, we are leaving behind the shackles of 20th century Hollywood and moving into, well, in fairness, not very far into the 21st century. It was 2001, to be fair. October 2001, to be even more exact. Will you join me, please, for all of the ups and downs for Enterprise Season 1, Episode 1, Broken Bow. Enterprise arrived at a very strange time in history. As I said, we've just stepped over the millennium, and yes, I can remember it a bit more clearly than I wish I wanted to, but also it debuted in October of 2001. Obviously, there was rather a lot going on in the world at that point, and this rosy, utopian, optimistic view of the future, while on paper, might seem like a great thing for the audience at the time. Unfortunately, the audience didn't tend to agree. Enterprise struggled throughout its run with the ratings. There was a couple of reasons for this. The aforementioned everything of it all, but also it was undoubtedly facing a little bit of franchise fatigue. Remember, since 1987, there had been a new season of Star Trek pretty much every year without fail. And while you and I might be like, yes, more, give me more, the truth is, people were beginning to lose interest. So that's the climate that Broken Bow premiered in, and it had to swing big to capture audiences. Did it? Well, it's a pretty good pilot, I'm not gonna lie to you. We open with a flashback introducing us to young Jonathan Archer and his dad, Henry. They're working together to build a wee model ship. Now, many of you out there will have built model ships with parents. Many of you out there will have built model ships solo. Many of you out there will have never built a model ship in your life. Doesn't really affect the episode at all, just worth mentioning, really. We get a couple of Easter eggs here in terms of dialogue. We get one of our first drops of Where No Man Has Gone Before, and we get a reference, of course, to Dr. Cochrane. Chronologically, this is not that long, in the grand scheme of things, after First Contact, which was, of course, April 5th, 2063. This comes a few decades after the Vulcans arrived on Earth, in Bozeman, Montana to be exact, and things are not exactly rosy between the humans and the Vulcans. Yes, the humans are now aware that there is intelligent life out there in the cosmos. It's funny really, because when you go through Star Trek and you realize all of the times humanity encountered aliens before this, it makes First Contact a little bit, possibly less special. But sure, listen, we won't be concentrating too much on that. That's a job for something like, temporal observations. Henry is very reasoned. Jonathan Archer is not exactly the biggest fan of the Vulcans. He calls Soval Ambassador Pointy, for example. Oh, there's Vulcan racism in this episode. Henry, however, advises that the Vulcans probably have their reasons for getting the humans to move slowly, whatever their reasons may be. We are being shown straight away that, Jonathan Archer is this symbol of youth. He is a child. And Henry Archer is someone who has lived that bit longer, has that bit much more experience, and has that calm that the younger minds are going to need going forward. Overall, I think Henry Archer is an up for me, and this is a damn good opening scene because it sets the scene so clearly for, this character that we are going to follow for, as it would transpire, the next 4 years. What we then do is jump forward 30 years to Broken Bow, Oklahoma, and let's just get in with it right away. We're gonna go down for the Klingon, and it is a continuity down. Listen, I'm gonna get this out of the way. Yes, I am well aware that Enterprise dealt with the idea of smooth-headed Klingons versus ridged Klingons by its final season. This, to me, I vividly remember watching this episode, and I, as a young person, went, oh, they had made such overtures about this was a prequel, this was before Kirk and Spock. And it seemed to me even then that they didn't have any faith in it. that you needed to have everything look exactly the way it did in Next Generation DS9 Voyager, otherwise audiences would switch off. Part of me wonders, what was the point of introducing a Klingon in this opening scene anyway? You know, why not establish your own look? Which, I will say, the rest of the episode does quite well. There is immediately, Enterprise is visually distinctive, as are many of its aliens. But for me, introducing the Klingon and having the Klingons be as much of a plot point in this episode is a down. On that point about Enterprise having its own visual identity, the Suliban taken up from me. I really like the design of the Suliban. There's some things that Enterprise does that, you know, the problem with the prequel is that, well, you know, we didn't see them before, ergo they didn't exist. Well, no, not really. They were just not seen. And the Suliban fall under that. Humans may not have encountered the Suliban, but doesn't mean other alien races haven't, as we will discover with Phlox later on. I did have a funny moment actually, as Clang was running through that cornfield and was being chased by the Suliban, and he comes across a silo, the farmer comes out with a 22nd century, version of a gun. And I'm not gonna lie, I thought to myself, it's set in America, of course he's got a gun. What did you think was going to happen? The Klingon hides in the silo. Again, not a good place to go if you're being chased by people with guns. And then, you know what we get? In my head, had aged the CGI a little bit worse than we actually got. I was watching, say, the Suliban flatten themselves and go under that door, and I thought, you know what? That's actually aged okay. Because Enterprise was the first Star Trek series not to rely on filming models, for example, and to rely so heavily on CGI. It had begun in DS9, carried over into Voyager, but from Enterprise onwards now, we were sort of done with a lot of the practical effects that would be seen in previous editions. And I have to say, I dig it. I've seen much, much worse CGI out there. The Klingon then jumps out the top of the silo, lands on the ground, turns around, fires his disruptor, and destroys the silo. As you would imagine there was going to be a lot of methane explosion. He then turns around and gets shot in the chest by the farmer. Again, America. Overall, look, my problems with the Klingon aside, banger of an opening. We come to it at last. Do you have faith of the heart? Down. I know, there'll be people out there going, right, I'm switching off the episode. I understand. I have grown to really enjoy the Enterprise opening credits. And in fact, I tell you what, the credit sequence I quite like, following the journey of Discovery and of the Enterprise itself, right up until NX-01. But what I don't love, and I never did, was the song that plays over it. Of course, now I will be the first one to belt it out with karaoke, and I'm all for the joke of it, but when you know that they had a beautiful theme that could have worked over those opening credits, Archer's theme, it just strikes me as, oh, this was a little bit, we're trying to get the kiddies into this one, wasn't it? You know, we had, with Voyager, we'd launched a new network, the UPN, which, you know, would go on to spawn things like the CW and things like that. Here, I mean, there are stories of wanting a new band to play in the officers' mess every week on Enterprise, and it all seems a little bit try-hard, if you like. For me, it's a down. Sorry if it's your favorite thing. Thankfully, things improve pretty quickly as we join Archer and Trip Tucker in the shuttle pod on their way to the NX-01. I like the way Broken Bow does this. So first of all, taken up because the way they slowly introduce the NX-01. I remember when we were talking about Voyager last week in Caretaker, that I was, the strangest thing to be disappointed by, but I was slightly disappointed by the fact that we saw the opening credits of Voyager, and therefore Voyager itself, before we saw it in the episode. We get similar, I suppose. I know we do get a full reveal of it. Yeah, oh, maybe I'm picking and choosing. Anyway, I still like the way that they piecemeal introduce this ship. We don't get a full shot of it leaving for a while. One thing I have loved since the first episode, and I know this was a way of making it a bit more contemporary, a bit more modern, is I love that NX-01 hat. I have one. There we are now. Scott Bakula and Connor Trenier really have an ease between themselves as they're in this scene. You know, the whole Neptune and back in 6 minutes thing, that conversation is an up to me, as is Trip scratching the paint. That's an up for me as well. Although I will say, Trip, you are the chief engineer, so I'm sure you are in charge of the running and, you know, maintenance of the ship and everything, but stop creating work for people. Let them at least piloted out of space dock before you're asking them to do a new paint job. Archer is then hailed and told he needs to report to Starfleet Command back in San Francisco. First of all, I really like this version of San Francisco in this episode, but also Vaughn Armstrong, take an up. Admiral Forrest makes his debut in this episode, and Vaughn Armstrong, again, one of those actors like Jeffrey Combs, and in fact, has more Star Trek credits than Jeffrey Combs. Now, but he's one of those actors that just has been in so many different roles in Star Trek that if you don't necessarily recognize his face straight away, a lot of the time he's under an awful lot of makeup, you will recognize his voice. You know, he was in Heart of Glory in The Next Generation. He was in Deep Space Nine, several roles, but I mean, he was Seskal in season 7 of Deep Space Nine. He was also Karoth in Voyager as well, among with many other roles. He was also the unfortunate Romulan commander in Eye of the Needle. But I say unfortunate, but anyway, but here he is in full human form as Admiral Forrest. Yes, the name itself is an Easter egg. Gary Graham also returns to Star Trek. He had previously appeared in Star Trek Voyager as Ambassador Soval. Up from me. It might be slightly hard from Broken Bow alone to see why is Soval getting an up, because he's a bit of a dick, and to be honest, he is a bit of a dick. Soval goes through a journey. Do you know what's bonkers? It's funny to think this is the first episode of Enterprise that we've done an ups and downs for on this series. So please let us know if you want to see more episodes of Enterprise on these retro ups and downs. Although maybe I shouldn't count on my chickens before they hatch, because we still have this one to get through first. We get a scene that is basically exposition, but I think it's handled pretty well. And by that I mean we get sort of a quick, humans and Vulcans are tense. You know, they're allies, but I wouldn't call them friends at this point. The Vulcans, for example, are able to give the information that the Klingon who has been brought to Starfleet Medical is, well, a Klingon. We get a funny moment where one of the other admirals calls it a Klingot. And no, Klingon. And then Soval says, no, the Klingons have been very clear they want us to handle this. All of the eggs in this scene. You can see that there is barely restrained hostility between the two. I don't think at this point in their history it would erupt into anything more than just kind of teeth grinding, but you can clearly see that we are nowhere near the Kirk-Spock relationship that would come about 100 years later. Archer arrives effectively in the middle of this argument, and there is the reveal that Klang is a courier who is bringing information back to the Klingon Empire. Soval has advised that this should delay the launch of Enterprise, and then you get Archer going, oh, what a surprise. You think they'd come up with a better reason this time? Up. Again, just painting this picture of the frustration that the human race is feeling toward the Vulcans, who they feel are standing on their throats almost. The Vulcans do counter back with, yeah, look, if we hadn't stepped in, the Klingons would be here with a fleet of warbirds by the end of the week. And to be fair, knowing what we now know about the Klingons, he's probably got a point. One of the Vulcans slips and says, bring his corpse back, and Archer says, hold on, and he walks in to speak to taken up John Billingsley as Dr. Phlox to go, hey, is this man dead? You know, is he going to die? And Phlox like, no, not necessarily. Yeah, the Vulcans were just going to unplug him. And I do like this exchange as well, because again, you know, from a purely logical standpoint, they need to bring him back. They can't wait around. Here we are. I do get it. But, you know, there has to be something. But they do mention as well about knowing about the Klingons are a warrior race. And, you know, this could also be seen as an honorable death. As we will come to see in years later, the Vulcans really do understand the Klingons. There is an exchange that I do not care for, and this is, we see T'Pol, and I will talk about T'Pol, but this is T'Pol accusing Archer of volatility, and to which Archer counters with volatile, well, you've no idea how much I'm restraining myself from knocking you on your ass. Down. It's not a down that Archer threatens her. It's nothing to do with man, woman, anything like that. It's that there's tension and that's a threat. You could say that you're restraining yourself, but that's a threat. Archer, that is not becoming of somebody who's about to captain a starship. That always seemed like a very weird exchange and inclusion for me. Jolene, however, is just brilliant, as she was always going to be. Archer uses this as an opportunity. He says, well, look, I can have Enterprise ready to go in 3 days and we'll take that guy back to Kronos. Forrest is all for it. There's a funny line saying, well, you're not ready. Your comm officer is in Brazil. Heavens to Betsy, not Brazil. Brazil's lovely. I've been there. I would go back in a heartbeat. And also, you don't have a chief medical officer. I mean, I'd almost pan the camera to Phlox and have him go at that point because, come on now. So Vol slips a tiny bit here and he sort of shouts at them, to which Archer does reply back. So when logic fails, you raise your voice. You've been around humans too long. Up. I also like as well how much Admiral Forrest and Archer clearly know each other well when he turns around and says, don't screw this up. Up. We get another little scene of exposition here that also introduces us to Reed and Mayweather, our Chief Tactical Officer and our Chief Navigation Officer. We're also shown the transporter being used to move cargo. There's a little bit of back and forth about, oh God, can you imagine we're going to move some organic stuff through this? Ha! Perish the thought. Setting up some pretty obvious things later on. But what we also get is a little bit of backstory that just suggests about Mayweather's upbringing on cargo ships as well. What I like about this exchange is that it is a bit of an exposition dump, but it's also, I think, handled quite smoothly as we move through the corridors of Enterprise. There's also that little nod about what they know about Klingons, with a few eggs in here, like, I hear that Klingons sharpen their teeth before they go into battle. Yep, I'd well believe it. We also just get that little thing there of Mayweather saying, is the gravity a bit heavy? And this discussion of, on his ship, they used to keep the gravity a little bit lower, so now it feels like he's got lead in his boots. But what I really like here, and an up, is I love the warp core for Enterprise because it looks like a functioning warp core. Sometimes as beautiful as engineering on the Enterprise D is, and as seriously beautiful as the engineering on Voyager is, honestly, they are both feast for the eyes. This one looks like it's a bloody big engine that runs a ship. It looks like it's a clanker. It looks like it needs to have a team of engineers working it the whole time. Where, quite frankly, the other two look like a couple of buttons in their grant. Now, in fairness, it's almost 200 years later, so yes, storyline-wise, it makes sense. So this has been gorgeous to me. I really, really like it. And I also want to say here, up to the uniforms for Enterprise, and I will also say this one took me a while. I didn't love them the first time I saw them. I didn't like that sort of utilitarian jumpsuit look. I have since come to love it for pretty much the same reason I love the Warp Core. They look like a team of people who are working on a ship, as opposed to a team of people walking around in very stylish pajamas. You know me, I loves me uniforms, and I loves how they all look. And sometimes the story demands they look a certain way, and I'm here for it. We thankfully go down to visit Brazil. Honestly, the way they talked about Brazil was like, oh, it was hell on earth. No, it's not, it's Brazil, it's beautiful. And we get introduced to Linda Park as Hoshi Sato, teaching her class of students how to speak in alien languages. I really like this scene. I feel like she gets a somewhat better introduction than some of the other characters, because it really feels like they were setting her up to be quite a big character in Enterprise. Whether that actually ended up happening or not, I want to give an up to Hoshi in this episode. I really like her exchange with Archer as they're walking through the trees, and Archer is sort of somewhat playfully, if you like, teasing her, saying, oh, I could order you back into service, to which she goes, well, then you'd have to reprimand me, which would have a black mark on my record, which means I couldn't serve on a starship. They're somewhat at a stalemate, and then Archer plays his hand and says, do you want to be the first human to ever speak to a Klingon? And she's like, ha, sorry, what? It works. I really like it. And I also really feel that they know each other. Again, another really successful thing that Enterprise does in Broken Bow is you get a sense of people who are not just a bunch of strangers on a ship together. These people, at least some of them, have an established relationship. This exchange, Archer and Hoshi, up from me. Aboard Enterprise, Archer and Trip speak about some concessions that Starfleet has made to the Vulcan High Command. Namely, for the use of their star charts, they're going to take a Vulcan observer on board. Now, Trip is quick to say, oh, so we have a spy, do we? It's, as Archer says, it's a quick 4-day jaunt each way. Yes, I will be coming back to discuss the distance between Earth and Kronos. I like things like, you feel the cabin, again, very cramped, very submarine, but you have those images of the different ships' Enterprise on the wall, but most importantly, you've got Porthos. Up, Porthos. Porthos is amazing. Porthos is a good boy, and he gets an up. Okay? Right, just so we're clear on this. He's a good boy. T'Pol is somewhat better introduced in this scene than she was in that exchange down at Starfleet Medical. Jolene Blalock is just bloody wonderful as T'Pol throughout the 4 seasons. I'm going to be very honest, everyone eases into their roles, okay? Everyone gets there. No one is perfect from the jump. And I'm looking at every member of the cast here, although arguably I'd say John Billingsley is the closest. She walks in, she is playing a Vulcan, and she absolutely nails it. And we also get that moment of, she smells Porthos, and we get that little exposition on it, but yes, Vulcan females have a heightened sense of smell. Well, that would come back, wouldn't it? But Porthos obviously decides that she's good, because Porthos goes over to say hello. You know that feeling when you go to a party and the pet chooses you? Yeah. Up. I have to say as well, I do like the introduction between Trip and T'Pol. Again, sort of knowing where it goes. Trip, I'm called Trip. I'll try to remember that. There's no handshake. Yeah. Up. Things are not quite frosty, but it's quite clear that T'Pol did not request the assignment, nor did Archer, to be fair, but they are working together. And her goal is not espionage, it is synergy. And they will all do their roles to the best of their ability. And then she requests to be excused, and away she goes. We then get a fun scene, which is, of course, the launch of NX-01. Admiral Forrest gives a quick speech where he says that this is 90 years on from first contact. So that means that we are about 2150s going around here. In fact, we get an exact date later on. But then we get our cameo from Taken Up, James Cromwell, continuing the trend of having someone from a previous iteration of Trek appear in the opening episode as a nod, as a sort of a passing over of the guard. Now, I hope you enjoyed this one, because things will change as we go into our next episode of Ups and Downs. This is a scene just filled with Easter eggs. That's what this scene is about. But playing over all of it is Up, Archer's theme. This is a beautiful piece of music. It has returned in Star Trek a couple of times since, quite notably in Star Trek Discovery with the unveiling of Archer's space dock. But this music is just beautiful, and it pretty much plays over the closing credits to most of the episodes of Enterprise. It has always been a standout for me, and probably should have been the opening theme tune, I'm just saying. Immediately after this, we take Enterprise out of space dock and we get the glorious reveal of Doug Drexler's design for the NX-01. I mean, come on, take an up. As they're about to go to warp, T'Pol points out that the coordinates are out of alignment by 0.2 degrees. And Archer basically says, sure, it's grand. Down! You're gonna go faster than the speed of light. Get your coordinates correct. Jeez. So we jump forward now into a completely different scene, completely different setting. And this introduces us to Silik, played by John Fleck. He is talking to the man who would come to be known as Future Guy. That is very much a behind the scenes and fan name. It's not exactly said in Enterprise ever. I will say, Up. He is played by James Horan, who had appeared several times in Star Trek before. He was Joe Brill in Suspicions in The Next Generation, and also that tactical officer in Descent. He also played a Jem'Hadar in DS9. He's played a few roles, but he has such a distinctive voice. Silik, who, by the way, John Fleck is an up. I think he's brilliant in this role. Straight away, we get the idea of there is temporal fun going on here. The effect of that sort of temporal playing with space-time in this room is, I would say, it's both aged quite well, and there's a kind of a corniness to it, but I think it's aged well. But what he does is he does reveal that, yes, the Klingon got away, and 2 of his people were killed in the explosion. He then says, 1 was a friend. Is there anything you can do to prevent it? Up. Silik might be our bad guy, but we also see that he does care. And I thought it was such a clever thing to include in this scene. Future Guy ain't got time for that. Back aboard Enterprise, we have this sort of reintroduction, if you like, of Phlox. And I just love how upbeat Phlox is all the time. taken up, especially the fact that he loves Chinese food. I love Chinese food. So, we're basically the same person. I mean, we look exactly the same, right? Right? But just this exchange between himself and Archer, where, we get this kind of backstory to the Vulcan interspecies medical exchange. Again, the Vulcans, for as much as they're not painted as good guys, they're also not demonized in this episode, which, in fairness, is a bit of a balance to walk. I will say, that smile that Phlox does never once failed to creep me out. He is quite happy to be examining a living Klingon, because normally he examines dead ones, which, as a doctor maybe is not that strange of a thing to say, but out of context. Trip has gone looking for Mayweather and finds him sitting in what Mayweather calls the sweet spot, which is a part of every ship, according to Mayweather, where the gravity is a little bit funky. So basically, he's sitting on the ceiling as Trip climbs up a ladder. He advises Trip, hey, push up and away you come. And I like this idea that every ship has one of these. It's one of those ones, again, where just because we didn't see it on the Enterprise D or Voyager doesn't mean it wasn't there. And yeah, this does nothing in terms of canon, but I suppose also you could argue that 100, 200 years on, they fixed it, or it was something that was said, look, we don't need one of these. I like to think that there is a little part on every single ship where people can sit down and have a private conversation. What I don't love is the conversation they have. It's just a bit Gene Roddenberry. And by which I mean they're clearly talking about the women on Drelex have three. Yep, on one hand, and the other hand, and the third hand. And it goes back to the behind the scenes of the Next Generation when they were coming up with the idea of, the character that would become Deanna Troi, who was originally, they were going to have her with three breasts for no other reason. Then people would find that erotic. Then that idea turned up in Total Recall with Lysia Naff's character. And I don't know, it just seems a bit silly. And then, great, cool. So what do we know about these two people? Cool, they're horny. I cannot stress how horny the crew of the NX-01 is. They are so horny. Look, if you've seen all of Enterprise, you know what we're about to face. In the officers' mess, Trip says that, can't dine with my crewmates today because I'm having dinner with the boss. And he walks into the captain's private dining chamber where Archer and T'Pol are there. A little bit of small talk where T'Pol says that actually she kept herself to the Vulcan compound and didn't explore Earth. We will find out that that's not entirely true. And I'm not gonna lie, I've kind of got a bit of a down for Archer and Trip in this scene. They're sort of needlessly rude, and they're a bit overly insulting toward Vulcans. Again, I suppose in the context, I get that humans and Vulcans are not the best friends, but here they seem to be taking the joke a little bit too far, and they really are kind of ostracizing T'Pol. Now, I don't mean the joke about, don't worry, we didn't forget that you're a vegetarian. That's fine, like that actually, and then I do love the payoff where she, actually manages to use a knife and chop through the breadstick. That actually, I really, really like that. But yeah, just there's a little bit too much jibing going on here. Certainly not doing anything to make her more comfortable. There is, I think, an important exchange here, which is where Trip sort of defends humanity by saying, look at war, look at disease, pretty much wiped out in 2 generations. We can dream, Trip, can't we? We can dream. And Archer says, human nature is pretty powerful. You can't expect us to change overnight. And that's when T'Pol reveals she has chopped through the breadstick going, with enough dedication, anything is possible. And I quite like, that's an up, I quite like that message. The ship begins accelerating through the speeds, and Hoshi begins to say that I can feel a bit of vibrations. Suddenly she can't, but then she can a little bit. T'Pol says, would you be more comfortable back in your quarters? To which Hoshi snaps at her in Vulcan. And in fairness, T'Pol gives back as good as she gets. She says, I've been instructed to speak English on this voyage, and I would appreciate if you did the same. Phlox signals from sickbay to say that this Klingon is waking up. And even though Hoshi goes down and they try to understand what's going on, he's talking gibberish. I'm not sure of the characterization of Hoshi in this scene, because they kind of really have her panicking quite quickly. And it's more panic than frustration. It's like, here is this character who is supposed to be the most supremely talented linguist in Starfleet at this point. And the first hurdle seems to be her just more frustrated and snapping at people than anything. And unfortunately, it would be a bit indicative of what they do with Hoshi's character as Enterprise goes on. This is by no means the fault of Linda Park. This is just a bit like, hang on, you were supposed to be brilliant. And instead, what you're doing is getting in a flap. Clang wants to know where his ship is, but that's about the most sensible thing they get out of him. Next thing we know, everything shuts down. You see the warp nacelle shooting it. So obviously, okay, the Suliban have infiltrated the ship, and what they do is they shut down all the power. Now, thankfully, they obviously knew not to shut down too much of the power, or the antimatter could have exploded, killing them all. But what I will say is that shot of the Suliban crawling through the dark on the ship is very creepy, and that's an up to me. And I like that sort of tension, that frightening scene in sickbay, and then that Suliban just dropping down on Clang as well. Then as the lights come back up, Clang's just gone. It was a good inclusion of horror, quite frankly, in this episode. We get our first mention via Clang of the word Suliban. We get a scene then that both makes sense and is a little bit frustrating, and that's T'Pol going, "You lost the Klingon, back to Earth we go." Archer then, in a very kind of standard, it's, Starfleet captain kind of way, you fully expect him to do this. Oh, well, no, we have to go and find him. T'Pol counters with, "Space is very big, Captain. Your mission makes no sense." And then we get Archer going, "I'm not interested what you think about our mission. Take your Vulcan cynicism and bury it with your repressed emotions." Down. Archer's not looking well at this point. He's beginning to sound petty as opposed to frustrated. And remember, this is our introduction to the captain of the ship. It was a strange sort of introduction. There is a journey, there is a growth. Like, I'm not slating the whole thing, don't get me wrong. But little bits like this do tend to stand out. We also reveals how personal all this is. He says, "I watched your scientists bury the information about the Warp 5 engine long enough that Henry, his father, didn't live to see it in action." So he's hurt, he's upset, he's angry, but it's personal and it is clouding his judgment. This obviously leaves T'Pol a bit frustrated, but we'll come back to her in a second. Down in sickbay, Phlox has done an autopsy on the Suliban, and quite frankly, it's sort of cheery in a grim way. He's delighted with the amount of genetic engineering the Suliban has gone through. Now he's able to reveal, yes, I've heard all about the Suliban, but they're not usually like this. They're no more sophisticated than humans. So there we get our introduction to there's changes going on in this race of aliens. Trip and T'Pol are bickering over the warp core. They're talking about how to trace the plasma, or degrading plasma trail of the leaving ships. T'Pol says, Vulcan children play with sensors more sophisticated than yours. And sick burn, I'm not gonna lie. There is one thing though. Hoshi arrives and she's translated as much as she can of what Clang was saying. A lot of it was gibberish, but she got 4 words that she reckons are proper nouns, that there is no comparison for. And she says one of them is Rigel. Archer has never heard of Rigel. And that's a down. We're sitting here in 2025 and we know Rigel. You know what I mean? So that to me was just a bit like, I know why you want to include Rigel, because Rigel, we go all the way back to the Cage. It was Rigel 7 where they had the run-in, and that's why Pike felt the way that he did. This is Rigel 10. Okay, so different planet, but you would have heard of Rigel, Archer. Off to Rigel 10 we go. Clang has been brought back to the Suliban and is being interrogated, and he's pumped full of drugs, and he's saying, "I don't know what the message was." And the Suliban says, "He's telling the truth." So Silic then is also like, well, off to Rigel 10 we go then. We get also the first drop of the name Saren. We also get introduced to the shuttle pods. They were an acquired taste. I didn't immediately take to the shuttle pods the way I took to the NX-01, but now I love them. I love them, and I love that they made an appearance in Star Trek Beyond, just throwing that out there. Before they go down, Phlox advises the food and drinks are probably fine, but to avoid intimate relations with any of the locals. Horniest crew ever. T'Pol has good advice for them as they go down. She said, there is something about human nature, which is you want to get involved and you want to do the right thing, but I'm going to advise you against doing that here. While we don't dwell too long on it, we get plenty of examples of how human nature prejudges what it sees. For example, where Trip sees that young boy seemingly being forced to breathe something that's toxic to him, and he wants to intervene, only for T'Pol to say, no, that species, they only breathe a certain type of gas until they're 4. That mother is weaning him off. You don't understand what you're talking about. It's actually a kind of a good reminder for, I think, Star Trek fans as much as anything else, for we've seen things a certain way for so long that things are not always what they seem on the surface. When discussing Enterprise, it's kind of hard not to discuss Star Trek tits and ass. And what I mean by that is that, put aside the horniness for a second, and we'll talk about the decon chamber in a moment, but Enterprise, out of all of the others, really came out the gate showing skin, titillating, trying to, get the teenage male audience. And you can see it here with the dancers, they're eating the butterflies, and you've got Reed and Mayweather with their jaws on the ground and their tongues even lower. Look, I do not want this to come across like, oh, Sean, you're a bit of a prude. Not like this and all. But Jolene Blaylock spoke about it when she said tits and ass do not substitute for a story. We know at this stage that going into the third season, T'Pol's uniform changes. And at the time, they were open about it. The ratings were down, and so down went her neckline. And it's here from the beginning. And when that's one of the things you rely on, a bit like having a Klingon who looks like a 24th century Klingon, to me as a viewer, I'm like, you don't trust what you're showing us here, do you? Now, there's many reasons behind that. I'm sure there was a lot of pressure from the network, okay? I'm not trying to immediately demonize everyone here. But as a viewer, that's what I take from scenes like this. Archer and Hoshi go down into the barrels of this building, and I mean, fisticuffs were inevitable, and therefore, there were fisticuffs. They get captured pretty quickly, and it's revealed that Trip and T'Pol were captured pretty quickly. Shouldn't have messed with a kid in his gas, should you, Trip? Archer is taken before Saren, and yes, spoke about all of that. She's actually, I really like Melinda Clarke, who plays Saren here. I remember seeing her in things like Xena, Firefly, and also Return of the Living Dead 3, which is so underrated, by the way. If you haven't seen it, do give it a go. And they present her, first of all, as human in appearance. And then, you have, she kisses Archer, and it's revealed then that that is how she has an ability to trust people if she has to be close to them first. Okay, look, we know what we're doing. But actually, and then she reverts to her Suliban state. And I really like this character, and I really wish she'd stuck along for longer. She's there as a sort of a plot along. Very quickly, the rest of the Suliban arrive. They're firing at everyone. She gives Archer enough information to say, you have to get Klang to Kronos. The Suliban cabal, not all of them, just some of them, they have been working with temporal agents, ding, 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 as part of a temporal Cold War, ding, 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 to destabilize elements of the Klingon Empire, to force it into a sort of civil war. The Klingons need to know that, and that is the message that Klang is bringing back to the High Council. And that is the message that Future Guy and Silik do not want the Klingons to know. There's actually quite an uncomfortable scene in which, once the shooting starts, Trip, Hoshi, and T'Pol are stuck in that cell. And it also looks, they are rats in a cage. And poor Alsarin is shot by Silik, and that's pretty much the end of her. So thanks for playing, Melinda Clarke. You were great. And then they're trying, because I was thinking, where are Reed and Mayweather? The next thing, they're in the shuttle. They just went back. They never bothered to tell anyone. Down. Thanks, lads. Look, it might work out that you're there, but you might have mentioned you were heading back to the shuttle pod. There's also one other thing, right? So, okay, there's a snowstorm outside. Grand. Next thing, we get a bit of a, phaser fire going on outside. Grand. Reed, the chief tactical officer of NX-01, says, that's odd for there to be lightning in a snowstorm. Down. You mean your immediate reaction wasn't, that's clearly weapons fire? Reed, you gotta have a word with yourself. There's one quite funny moment how it's presented. It's like, okay, we need to scan for Vulcan life forms. And T'Pol literally just knocks on the window. And Mayweather's like, found her. I've always liked that scene. And we get an important moment here as well, which is, when we got to the surface, there was a kind of a question of left or right and what way to go and everything. Right, fine. Now, we know where the shuttle pod is, and Archer is going to lay down covering fire. T'Pol is knocked back down. She needs help. So Archer's going to go and get her. In that exchange, he says, Trip, get Hoshi back to the shuttle. He goes to get T'Pol. T'Pol says, Enterprise needs her captain. You need to go. And he says, basically, shut up and get back to the shuttle pod. And he is shot during that exchange. And it is the beginning of the thawing of the two. You can also see as well how Enterprise went for action in their pilot. What I think is that as we went on, Encounter to Emissary to Caretaker to Broken Bow, We increased the amount of action each time. I don't think we sacrificed story. I think good lessons were learned throughout. Yeah, there's bits where, broken bow slips a little bit, but overall, this is a solid pilot. I really like, taken up, by the way, T'Pol assuming command. There's no nonsense, it's straight to the point. She assumes command, they get into the shuttle pod, and up they go. As Archer is sort of fading in and out of consciousness on the shuttle pod, he remembers his dad saying straight and steady, which is the order he gave Mayweather to pilot out of space dock. But also, he remembers his dad saying to him, you have to learn to trust the wind. And we get a shot of T'Pol. So T'Pol is the wind? Yeah, okay. Right, then we get the scene that is probably the most controversial scene in the episode. And it's the decon chamber, and it's the decon gel. Lad, I have to down it. I have to down it because this was done for the trailer. That's what this was. I mean, you've got, they are having a conversation, and actually we do learn things, but then you've got, I've got my gel, and I'm just going to rub it gently over the small of Jolene's back, and then I'm going to rub her ears and everything. I will say they have Jolene in her pants, you've got Conor Trenier in his pants, so, there's something for everyone. But, folks, was this conversation necessary here? No, it wasn't. And I know there are people watching this video going, Sean, lighten up. And I understand. I do. And I love that Lower Decks would come back and parody this later on, because it is silly and it should be laughed at. It doesn't mean it's not been enjoyed by many, many people. Several times a day, in fact. But yeah, this really is the most egregious scene of, you were going for a really specific audience, weren't you? You do kind of learn a bit about both. You learn about T'Pol's confidence, you learn about Trip's obviously ongoing friendship with Archer. He's quite indignant on Archer's behalf. And then speaking of Archer, as we go to sickbay and his leg is on the mend, one thing I really like about Phlox and this early type of medicine is that it's not like, we'll just bang him in the dermal regenerator. No, he's got an eel that sits on his leg and helps to heal the wound. T'Pol and Trip enter, and they reveal that T'Pol took command. And Archer, still a bit of the previous Archer going, well, you didn't wait around. And T'Pol says, relinquishes command back to him, and away we go. And Trip reveals that they, the pair of them, had tracked down the Suliban plasma trails, and not only that, it was her idea. Oh, nice one, Trip. Credit where credit is due. Our very first star log, April 16th, 2161. Okay, there we go. That answers the year question. And yeah, it's our first captain's log of Enterprise. And you have Archer keeps interrupting himself because he's now confused by T'Pol's show of, is it loyalty? Is it friendship? He's not sure. He asks Porthos for his advice. Porthos isn't sure either. He just wants some cheese. They discover a Type 7 gas giant together, and they're able to piece together the fact that one decay trail wouldn't leave enough for what they find. So actually, 14 ships have been by recently. They've definitely found some sort of little hub for Suliban. And in fact, speaking of Suliban, Silic is being held to task by the future guy. He is not happy that the crew of Enterprise managed to get away. And if needs be, that ship is going to need to be destroyed because the humans and Vulcans were not meant to be involved in events at this point in history. I like it, there's a bit of a gag as they fly into the gas giant and Hoshi says, you might recommend seatbelts once we get back to Starfleet. Sorry, Hoshi, that one's going to take a couple of 100 years before seatbelts get installed on ships. They then discover what is called the Helix, which is actually a really beautiful design. Do you have to say, that's a really nice design. And we see those Suliban cell ships and some of the other versions of ships as well. And again, it's aged quite well. They scan to see if they can find a Klingon life sign, and they're all a bit hesitant to try the transporter because Archer says, I don't think we should try and turn him inside out. They do find that there's about 3,000 Suliban on board. Oh dear. They come up with a plan that would involve using a grappling hook. There's a real sense of, how do I say it? Art attack. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like, you use your, bottle of washing up liquid and some tubes and some paper and you build a phaser. You know what I mean? Like, so, as these Suliban ships, they detect and begin to attack the Enterprise, they're able to, basically fire a plunger, grab it, and I'm sorry, just that scene of the Suliban just ejecting out of the ship is actually quite funny to me. And, for all of the logic of having an engineer and the captain on board this cell ship, I have to... Down, same logic. Ben Affleck asking Michael Bay, why would you train a group of oil drillers how to be astronauts when you could just train some astronauts to be oil drillers? And his answer was, shut the F up. And it's the exact same thing here. Why isn't Mayweather flying this? Because that's the reason. There's also a bit of an odd thing of, Archer saying, I thought you understood why we had to do this alone. No, I don't. Down. That's a weird argument to make to T'Pol. I'm also possibly about to incur some ire, but down, I've never liked the phase pistols from Enterprise. I am sorry, but they look far too much like plastic toys. Now, I've been spoiled on hand phasers all my life, so if it's your favorite one, I apologize. But yeah, for me, it does look like a ray gun from the 50s. As we pilot toward the Helix, we get a great kind of callback as Trip once again crashes a ship. Trip, could you stop doing that? Please, if you wouldn't mind. It is an up though, it did make me smile. They dock and they go inside. They do find Clang. They manage to get him to understand roughly that they're there to help him as opposed to do anything else. And they try and get him back toward their little cell ship. They've also come up with this idea that all of the other cell ships are joined by magnetics. So if they can reverse the polarity, something in my eye, yeah. And as they're going along, they do use a tricorder. I will say, I didn't like the phase pistol. I do like the Enterprise tricorder. They bring a device that will do that. And Clang, despite the fact none of them could speak to each other, he manages to get in on the action by beating down one of the Suliban. I will say, there's one poor Suliban fella walks around a corner. He is only going to the loo. He's done nothing wrong to anyone, and Archer just shoots him straight in the chest. What did he do on you? There is a moment where Trip goes, this is going to be easier than I thought. Down, you might as well have just killed them all in one go. There, just put the phaser pistol to your head and that'll be the end of it. Well, in fairness to them, they do get off the Helix, they do get into the cell ship, they do reverse the polarity, and that shot of all of the cell ships breaking away from the Helix, it looks great, I'm not gonna lie, that's an up from me. Archer, however, is stuck behind on the Helix. The cell ship is going to try and find Enterprise. Now, Enterprise has been hiding in this phosphorus layer for this time, and effectively the Suliban have been firing depth charges at them. So they have to move, which means the rendezvous point, they're not there. So you've got Trip and Clang who are bickering at each other in the cell ship. I do like the bit where Trip turns and says, well, I don't not particularly like how you smell either, I'm so sorry for my accent there. But they do, everyone finds each other, happy days, and back they go. Archer still stuck on board the Helix. And we do get a moment where T'Pol's Vulcan mind does, it's like, the mission is get Clang to Kronos. I'm sorry, the mission is not save Archer. That was never the mission. And it's important. It's really important that Clang get there. I have to say, I understand her position. Trip uses his only card, which is Archer saved your life on Rigel 10. And it works. Meanwhile, in Future Guy's room, Archer is facing off against Silik, and just John Fleck is brilliant in this scene. He's so creepy and he does it so well. And the way he calls him John, it's just, it's unsettling, and he infers that he has looked through all of John's history and he can tell him the day he dies, or he can change that for him. The effects here may be tiny bit dodgy because it's so much part of the plot. I will say, remember, this is 2001. It's very Matrixy. Matrix was 1999, which is strange to think that these two things are only 2 years apart. But you can really see the Wachowskis' influence on this scene in particular. Archer does manage to get away, as we assumed he might, and as he's doing a runner, Silik has long since got his phase pistol, and he's beamed off. So this is our first human transport. And in fairness, Archer is like, what the hell? And it's also while running as well. To be fair, that's some pretty fancy transporting. Enterprise then escapes with the knowledge that there is a little difference between the Suliban and the humans. That they are quite similar, but the Suliban were not, or at least the Cabal, were not content to wait for evolution to make their changes. But that's it, Enterprise is gone, goes to warp, and arrives at Kronos, where they deliver Clang. Clang delivers the message in his blood. They are then told in no uncertain terms, get the hell off our planet. The final scene of the episode, or the final scenes of the episode, reveal that T'Pol is going to stick around on Enterprise. Admiral Forrest is given the green light for Enterprise to stay out there. And that, initially T'Pol was, of course, going to go back to the Vulcan High Command, but actually, maybe it might be best if she sticks around. And it's Archer's idea, and he is the one to say his own prejudice nearly derailed this mission, and that he needs to get over that. And part of that is accepting how crucial she was to the success of this mission. There is a great moment where he says, "Without you, this mission would have failed." And she goes, "I won't dispute that." Up. I don't think it's any surprise that I will be giving Jolene Blalock my latinum up of the episode, because she had such a thankless job of create a character that is emotion-free, carries the weight of every Vulcan we've ever seen before, and is also dealing with the Hollywood of the early 2000s of it all. And to say that she delivers, both here and onwards, is underselling how wonderful she is. She is one of the absolute standout stars of Enterprise right from the beginning. Archer says, if I ask you to stay, it will look like I don't have any confidence in my own command. So she counters with, "Perhaps I will say that you need my help here on the ship." Up. And then we get the order to head on, straight and steady, and that's the end of the episode. So will you join me, please, at Temporal Observations. This one grew on me. I'm not going to lie to you, as I said. Now, we get lots of eggs, as I say, where no man has gone before. Very obvious references towards the initial speech that Kirk makes in the opening credits of Star Trek. And it's the Captain's Pledge, as we would go on to hear it in almost every iteration of Star Trek. We get the reference, of course, to Dr. Cochrane. He was introduced, as you know, in the original series episode Metamorphosis, but then most prominently played by James Cromwell, who returns in this episode, playing Cochrane, reprising the role from Star Trek First Contact. I've spoken about the Klingons, Klang played here by Tommy Tiny Lister, who has sadly passed, but you will recognize from just so many different things. He was the president in The Fifth Element. This idea, again, I've spoken about the Klingons. As we know, going into the 4th season of Enterprise, they would use the augment virus as a way of explaining why some of the Klingons have smoothed heads. I feel the franchise learned from how much they didn't need to do this. I'm not talking about the Klingons that we see in Star Trek Discovery, but actually I'm talking about the Romulans and how it's explained away in Picard. Different Romulans look different. Great. One line of dialogue and they leave it at that. That, to me, would have been a better way. This is a vast empire. Not all of them have to look the same. The NX-01 itself, designed by Doug Drexler, clearly evokes images of the Akira class. Now, there is a story that it was originally just going to be an Akira class ship, which of course wouldn't make any sense. That was not introduced until the 2370s, which is over 200 years after the events of Enterprise. And I'm glad that obviously they didn't go with that. I like the Akira class. I think it's a lovely looking class of ship, and you can clearly see the inspiration. But the NX class, I think, the way Drexler designed it, it's so... You can see how he went backwards from Matt Jeffrey's design of the original Enterprise. And I remember, actually, this sounds like name-dropping, I promise I'm not, but I had a chance to speak to Doug before. And by the way, in all of this, Doug is currently crowdfunding for a documentary about his incredible work that's coming up. And do please check him out on socials. Follow Doug Drexler. I know he's very active on Facebook for details on that. But he spoke about how the one thing that sort of bugged him about Matt Jeffrey's design of the 1701 Constitution class was just how smooth everything was. And I mean, as much as I love it, it does look like it would be a bit hard to get it that smooth in general. So you can see the paneling and, the assembly of the NX-01 in each of the scenes in which it's depicted. And you can see as well how, particularly look at the nacelle casings of the NX-01, that's something that's been carried forward as recently as Strange New Worlds, and Discovery Strange New Worlds for the update of the 1701 there. Admiral Forrest is of course named after DeForest Kelley. And I love that little nod, because they didn't have to do that, and they did, and that makes me very happy. Also here, one of the Vulcans is played by Thomas Kopachi, and he's another one, like Vaughn Armstrong, like Jeffrey Combs, who just keeps turning up in so many different iterations of Star Trek. He's in Generations, he's in Voyager, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, obviously here in Enterprise. Just keep an eye out, and you'll probably see him from one episode to the next. The corn farmer who shot Klang was named Moore, and that to me just seems like a tip of the hat to Ronald D. Moore. We get Kronos being name dropped here. We also get a reference to Klingon warbirds. It's not the only time that we hear about Klingon warbirds. Technically, we're used to hearing things like birds of prey and battle cruisers, with warbirds more commonly when we're talking about Romulans. But yeah, like if you think over in the Kelvin universe, yes, somewhere it's a different universe, but over the Kelvin universe, their version of the battlecruiser was also called a warbird. So it's not a stretch of the imagination that they would be warbirds here as well. Phlox manages to just drop in a little egg there when he talks about Klang's redundant neural pathways. Redundant systems within the Klingon body is something that has been explored in Star Trek before. I think one of the big ones is in the Next Generation episode, Ethics, where some of Worf's redundant systems kept him alive after, well, the barrel fell on him. There's just no cool way of describing it. The barrel fell on him. They talk about how, for Klingons, they're a warrior race, so perhaps to arrive at anything other than standing would be seen as a disgrace. Everything about the launch of the Enterprise is clearly designed to evoke that scene from the motion picture. And maybe they listened when people said that, the whole 12-minute sequence was a bit long. I disagree. I completely disagree. But you can see that it's obviously what they're doing here. Even the design of the dry dock is very evocative of what we see in the motion picture. Reed and Mayweather make a joke about how Archer wouldn't put his dog through the transporter. Not cool. Not when we learn what happened with Admiral Archer's prize Beagle in Star Trek 2009. Think you're funny, do you? Reference to Klingons sharpening their teeth, which makes me think of Worf sharpening his teeth when Nog was auctioning off all of his items when he was going off to the Academy. Kronos is 4 days away from Earth. 4 days. So please explain to me how, in Star Trek Into Darkness, it takes them about 4 seconds to get from Kronos to... Listen, it's a different film, it's a different universe, it's 4 days. 4 days. That has, in fairness, been a mistake that happens a few times throughout Star Trek. The pictures on the wall of Archer's ready room, very evocative of those pictures you see in the rec deck of the motion picture, and of course we would see as the Gold Enterprises in the Next Generation, and then in the Enterprise E as well. Something actually they brought back for Picard's series too. The dog is named Porthos. Porthos is in fact one of the 3 Musketeers, and he is a very good boy. Vulcan females have a heightened sense of smell. Well, this would return in Star Trek Lower Decks when T'Lyn elected to have her nose cauterized so she wouldn't have to deal with the smell of humans. One thing about warp in a solar system, obviously we've been told it's a big no-no, don't do it. But this is the humans' first time out at this speed, and they're going to hang on until they get past Jupiter before they really push it. T'Pol says that she has not been outside of the Vulcan compound. We know that that's not true, because later on it will be revealed that she spent time at a jazz club, but also that she made a little trip to a town called Carbon Creek, which has some importance in her family. In engineering, did you see that they included the elevator that was, in The Next Generation, and obviously again in Voyager, but it was also back in the motion picture. I just love that little elevator that's just in engineering sections. I mentioned this already, but the shuttle pod, as we see it here, it would make a return in Star Trek Beyond. Because remember, the Kelvin universe follows on. Like, the events of Enterprise happened in the Kelvin universe. It's the 2230s where the timelines diverge there. So the Franklin is, a variation on an NX class. It was crewed by former Makos, which we would see introduced in the 3rd season of Enterprise as well. The Temporal Cold War is introduced right here in the beginning. It was a way for this prequel series to not be so removed from the rest of the franchise. And I do remember not loving it, if I'm honest, because I did think at the time that it was, again, as I mentioned with the Klingons, do you trust what you're giving us, or are you a bit nervous? And as it turns out, I think it's something that ends up being developed well, particularly with Daniels, and it's something that transfers over into Discovery too. I think it was kind of a lot to throw at us in this pilot episode, but overall, the payoff, I do think worked out. We would see things, particularly in Stormfront parts 1 and 2, where, the temporal Cold War seemingly ends. But then there's the temporal wars of the 26th and 27th centuries. There's the crew of the relativity of the 29th century. There is everything with, as I say, Daniels and Kovich that follows on after this. There is absolutely a series that could be done on the temporal Cold War. So it's funny, it's gone from something I really didn't like in Enterprise to one that has become, I think, one of the most interesting ideas ever included in the franchise. Sadly, at the time, the producers worried that it was becoming too confusing for the average viewer, which is why it's wrapped up in 2 episodes at the beginning of season 4. I like the decon gel gag that we get in Lower Decks because of this. When they go to visit Starbase 80, which is so old and so falling apart that you still need to go to the decon chamber before you can beam in. I mean, it's silly and it's meant to be silly there. Here, it was meant for something else altogether. In Archer's ready room, he's got the statue of Cochrane sitting on his shelf, which I thought was a really nice inclusion. And I would love to tell you I noticed it first time around. I did not. All of the references to reversing the polarity has to be a more than knowing nod toward a certain other long-running sci-fi series that, includes a blue box. Why is Klang's blood red? Why do they keep doing this to me? They always do, and it's not the only one guilty of it at all. Klingon blood is pink. At least that came back in Lower Decks. Overall then, Enterprise becomes the template for so much of what would come after. And as Doug Drexler said in our interview, at the moment, it is the only Star Trek that is present in every version of a timeline, of a universe. The NX-01 is there, Archer, T'Pol, Trip, all of them. They are there, they are a part of history in all of it. And I think that's pretty damn special. Duncan Rillick, no relation, and I collect relics from before the burn. Thanks to a temporal wormhole, I now have an unlimited supply of TrekCulture t-shirts, and I'm selling them to you! You could be wearing this stylish down and up t-shirt. Or, how about this fish watching design? Bright yellow on black, the colors I'd use in thumbnails, I tell you that for nothing. I plan to take these designs and transfer them via quantum duplication onto hats, mugs, and posters. So look out for those. Ah! Treat this unlimited supply as a limited time deal. Get your t-shirt quick. Who's your daddy? That brings us to the end of this episode, folks. Thank you so much for watching along. You have been awesome. You've been wonderful. Next week, what we are going to do is we're going to cover the Vulcan Hello and the Battle of the Binary Stars. For pretty much a selfish reason, which is I only joined TrekCulture when season 3 of Discovery was airing. So there is no ups and downs for that pilot episode. So I hope you'll join me to see what I think of that opening. But until then, look after yourselves, folks. Of course, make sure that you live long and prosper. Whatever you do, do it with love, do it with kindness. Please make sure you're following us on the various socials. We're at TrekCulture, at TrekCultureYT on Instagram. I am at Sean Ferrick, and Eddie is at E.D. It's Eddie, are you okay? He's on Instagram. He's awesome, and he's great, and he edited this, and there's probably a big right now. But folks, look after yourselves. Everywhere that you can, try and put a bit of peace out into our world. To our friends in Palestine, in the Sudan, in Congo, please know that we love you and we want the fighting to end. To our friends in Ukraine, we just want safety for everyone. Please, if you can, be a part of that safety. Advocate for peace and advocate for love, and look after yourselves, folks. It's a crazy world out there. Be safe. Thank you very much. I will see you next week. Cheers.